Hi, everyone. Welcome to Experiential Realism and the continuation of last week's discussion with Professor Richard Oxenberg. I hope you enjoyed. Hi, Richard. Welcome
Hi,
to the
Arlen.
show.
Thank you.
Um, you wanted to go through the reasons why people are behaving the way they are in the political sphere. And, maybe you might want to say something about the theological and spiritual underpinnings of what's going on politically, and why is it that people side with Trump? Perhaps you might want to touch upon that, or maybe we've already discussed enough on that front. And maybe we could also discuss Christian existentialism and what the difference is between that and existentialism, and and some of Paul Tillich's teachings, maybe, and just the nuances. But yeah, I'll leave it to you to start wherever you want.
Yes, maybe the difference is between Christian existentialism um, and the kind of evangelical Christianity that we're seeing on the right would be an interesting thing to discuss. Um, yeah, after our last discussion, we were talking about, in some sense, the enigma, right? The mystery that you have these very devoted Christians on the right of Christianity, on the sort of right hand side, who have seemed to have been taken over by one of the most unchristian like figures in the history of American politics, Donald Trump. Who in when I say he is unchristian like, it's not, I mean, that seemed to me to be not even a controversial statement because he doesn't make any effort to
Yeah,
appear Christian like,
yeah,
right? He's egoist. He's like egoistic and proud of it. He's shameless in his being the diametric opposite of everything Christ preaches. And given that shamelessness, I mean, it's funny in I think it's in Matthew, Jesus warns against wolves in sheep's clothing. But Donald Trump is not a wolf in sheep's clothing. He's a wolf in wolves' clothing.
yeah,
He's not hiding. And so, how then do we explain
yeah,
mm, how Christians who are devoted, presumably, to the message and spirit of Christ could become so enamored of this man? And my field is philosophy of religion. And so that's my interest, philosophy of religion and philosophy of spirituality. And so, what I've been doing is trying to sit back and think in very broad terms about what this represents, what this moment in time represents. And one way that I would express it is that it represents, in some ways, for now anyway, the triumph of the ego over the spirit in American politics and in the American world, at least certainly on the right side of the equation here. Um, if you look at religion from the beginning and in almost any of the religions, what you find is that they all express what I think of as a struggle in some sense between the ego, what we might call the ego, and what we might call the spirit, both of which call to us, both of which motivate us. And ideally, in an ideal world, as all of the religions, as I see it, preach, the ego, in order to be healthy, even for itself, needs to be in communion with and ultimately governed by the spirit. Um,
yeah,
but it frequently resists that. And when the ego overcomes the spirit and eclipses the spirit, then we end up getting something like, I think, what we're seeing in American society today. You know, there's a passage in Genesis
Yeah.
in which patriarch Jacob is on one night he wrestles with apparently the spirit of God, and after his night of wrestling with the angel of God, or the spirit of God, um, he is renamed Israel. And the Bible explains that Israel means he who struggles with God and prevails. But prevails means that he comes to what God is. And that struggle is what I would think of as the struggle between the ego and the spirit. Um, but to make sense of that, we kind of have to step back and try and understand. I mean, I think we almost all understand what the ego is,
Yeah.
but but the spirit is a little bit harder to define.
Yeah.
Um, so I thought maybe we'd spend a little bit of time trying to define what that is, trying to talk about how the ego emerges out of that in some sense, and
Yeah.
what the nature of the conflict is between the two of them, and how that is maybe playing itself out in what now I think is in Trumpian Christianity, if we can call it that. Uh,
Yes. Yeah.
and I think we almost could call it that,
Yeah.
right? It's Trumpism rather than Christianity, and how that has how the ego has come to, in some sense, lay the spirit down. I mean, so it eclipses the spirit.
Yeah.
So I don't know. That's what I had in mind to discuss, Arlindo.
No, definitely. That's a good idea. I mean, when I look at Donald Trump, I see someone who is a slave to his ego.
Oh,
And this ego, it's almost like he finds it impossible to escape. He doesn't even contemplate escaping his own ego. And it makes it worse, the fact that he has to behave a certain way um, because so many people are watching him and he wants approval, he wants votes, he's a politician, and now he's the head of state in America, the head of all states.
yeah.
And he says things like, "Oh, I've heard that some people want a dictator. Maybe I act like a dictator, and some people want a dictator." So it's almost like a sociopathic, um, sociopathic way of relinquishing his responsibility. It's almost like he's saying, if I end up acting like a dictator, if you think I am a dictator, it's only because people wanted it. So it's not my fault. It's
All
their
right. Well,
fault.
what Trump, one of the things that Trump is pretty good at doing, frighteningly good at doing, is normalizing things that were prior to Trump regarded as completely unacceptable. Obviously, in the United States, the idea of anybody being a dictator is completely unacceptable. But what Trump does, and he's done this again and again and again, is he'll float an outrageous idea. And then everybody will get all excited about that outrageous idea that he's floated, right? And then he'll sort of withdraw from it, right? So calm everybody down, right? But
Yeah.
he's already, but by that time he's introduced it into the conversation. Then once everybody's calmed down again, he'll float it again. But this time people won't get quite as upset because they've heard it now before. And so it's not as shocking. And,
Yeah.
it seems almost redundant to
Yeah.
start screaming about it. And so now he can talk about it more and more without getting that level of resistance because people start just sort of shrugging their shoulders. Well, that's just Trump. And after a while, it's normalized, right? It becomes accepted. Well, maybe a dictator wouldn't be such a bad thing.
Yeah.
Um, and he's slowly, subtly introduced what I would almost think of as a diabolical idea.
Yeah.
The
He's
culture,
definitely normalized lying and being deceptive to the point where his own supporters will say things like, "Well, we know." Trump lies, but all politicians lie.
Right.
Besides, he's fighting his opponents and beating them at their game. So we don't mind if Trump lies because he has to. It's almost like they're saying he's fighting fire with fire, but he
Well,
agrees
yeah,
with our values. Is defending our values and is shaking up the system. I heard it so many times, especially during the pandemic, people saying we want Trump because he's shaking up the system and he's bringing change. And if he lies, well, the Democrats have also lied, and so has every other president that came before Trump.
yeah,
So they
yeah,
justify it. Yeah,
yeah. So, yeah, and all of this is the symptom, I think, of a society that has lost sight of the greater vision of what I am calling the spirit. So, what I thought I'd like to do is just try and lay out some basic, maybe even metaphysical, theological ideas
yeah,
to express what I feel stands behind all of this. Um, and what do we mean? What exactly do we mean by the spirit, right? Where did the spirit come from? How is the spirit different from the ego? And why should we pay attention to it? Let's start with that question. And um, and I think if you look at the different religions, the great religions of the world, there is, I believe, a common vision that we find in Hinduism, we find in Judaism, Christianity, and Islam, and it's there in Buddhism, but in a somewhat quieter way. Um,
yeah,
and what that vision is is the notion that underlying the enormous diversity of this world, right? This world is made up of infinite number of different things and different beings and different people and just endless
yeah,
variety of things. Underlying all of that diversity is a fundamental unity, right? And this unity can get called different things by different in different religions. In the Western religions, we call it God.
yeah,
In Taoism, it gets called the Tao,
yeah,
right? Um, in Hinduism, the name for this fundamental unity is Brahman.
yeah,
Um, and um, and in all of these religions, and one of the problems, it's funny the struggle between the ego and the spirit. I mean, each of these religions has its own sort of egoistic side to it, which makes it want um, um, to affirm itself above the other religions, so that each of the religions becomes suspicious of the ideas of the others,
yeah,
which I see largely an egoistic thing going on. But within Hinduism, I think we get one of the most precise ways of speaking about the nature of this unity. Um, and it is expressed in the Vedantic Hindu notion of Sat Chit Ananda,
oh
which
yes,
perhaps you're familiar
Saccidananda,
with.
yeah, yeah,
Sat Chit Ananda, right? So Satchitananda is made up of three terms, right? Sat, which means self-subsistent existence,
right,
right? That is the meaning of Sat, right? So the supreme unity is self-subsistent. It does not depend upon anything beyond itself. It exists in and through itself,
wow,
which is, of course, different from everything else, right?
yeah,
You and I, we don't exist in and through ourselves. We exist through our relationship with other things, right? We
that's
need to
right,
breathe. We need to eat. We exist in relationship with a world that is other than us.
yeah,
But the supreme existence is self-subsistent, and that is the Sat nature of
right,
this fundamental unity. Then there is the Chit nature of
right,
the fundamental unity, and that refers to its consciousness or awareness. I know that you've spoken of being an idealist,
yeah,
right? So
that's right,
the
yeah,
basis of idealism is the notion that consciousness
It's
is
fundamental.
fundamental to the nature of reality.
Yeah.
Um, and so that is expressed in the chit idea of
Right.
Saccidananda, right? Um, and finally, and all importantly, is the Ananda idea behind Satchitananda. Ananda means bliss.
Oh, I
And
see.
what bliss means is, and I want to say it, but it's always hard to find the right words for this. But
Yeah.
what bliss ultimately means is a kind of self satisfaction, being
Yeah.
fully satisfied in oneself. If when one is in a state of bliss, they are in a state of complete satisfaction. And
Yeah.
that's all important because what we on this lower level, right, we're not at the level of Satchitananda,
Yeah.
what we are constantly struggling for is some form of satisfaction.
Yeah.
So what this supreme unity is, and it has these three elements, but the important thing to see, I think, is that the three elements, Satchitananda, are not to be thought of as different attributes of the unity, but
One and the
they are
same.
all one. They're all the same, right? It's the same thing that is self-subsistent, that is supremely conscious, and that is also supremely self-satisfied, right?
Yeah.
That's what allows for self-satisfaction is that sense of self-subsistence. Um,
Yeah.
this is an intuition, by the way, that religious mystics have had in coming to feel a sense of unity with the divine. But it's an intuition that we can tap into, maybe we non-mystics, right? We can tap into in a negative way, in that we can recognize that it is that whereas the supreme is satisfied through its self-subsistence, we experience suffering
Yeah.
to the extent that our subsistence is threatened, right? In other words, what is required to be at peace is some sense of being grounded in that which is self-subsistent. And to
Yeah.
the extent that we ourselves do not feel sustained by anything secure, that gives rise to anxiety and
Yeah.
stress and suffering. Okay, that's kind of the first element of this.
Oh,
Um,
brilliant. Yeah. I'm so glad you explained the Ananda bit of Satchitananda because when I've been delving into philosophy and the works of people like F.H. Bradley, and he talks about absolute idealism, and basically his Brahman, I think, is what he calls the absolute. And his work is quite insightful in many respects, but I think is missing the bliss there, the Ananda bit,
the
and that's what I was
Ananda,
looking for because when I've had my own experiences of where all thinking just ceased to be when I stumbled upon that state. And people tell me it was like maybe a Rigpa state, or it goes to samadhi or something like that. I only experienced it very briefly, but it gave me some kind of lasting impact. And it always made me think, well, if there was no thinking, if consciousness ceased to move, the monkey mind just came to rest and there was this blissful stillness. I kept thinking to myself, is consciousness intrinsically blissful? Maybe it's a quality inherent of consciousness, because if all thinking ceased and I felt free and there was this joy, just the joy of being, it made me think, well, that every time someone talks about consciousness, if they don't mention that blissful quality, it's incomplete or they're missing something. And I know that when we talk about these things, we can only point to something original. You know, the map or the concept that we come up with is never the original thing. But I think it can be more complete when you include the bliss that goes with it. So the Ananda
Yeah,
makes perfect sense to me. Sacchidananda
yeah,
is a perfect term.
yeah. I would say that it's not only more complete, but the Ananda element to this is absolutely essential. Without understanding this, you just don't understand what's going on. I
Yeah,
mean, the Ananda is what it's all about, because the Ananda is what we're all on some level striving for,
yeah,
right? I mean, the self-subsistence, I mean, nobody would want to just self-subsist indefinitely in suffering, right?
no,
You wouldn't want to just go on in suffering, right?
yeah,
So the self-subsistence is only worth anything
yeah,
to the extent that it is accompanied by the Ananda. So the Ananda is actually, in some sense, the most important of these attributes. And of course, Ananda implies consciousness,
yeah,
right? I mean, a bliss that is not conscious is kind of not a bliss, right? So the Ananda entails the chit, right?
yeah,
And there is some need of that bliss to be self-subsistent in order for that bliss to be fully secure in itself. So in some sense, although we call it Sat Chit Ananda, we might call it Ananda Chit Sat, right?
right,
That the Ananda comes first, and then out of the Ananda we derive the idea of Chit, and out
yeah,
of the idea of Chit we derive the idea of self-subsistence.
I see.
Um, um, but the next step, and this is where we go from this, it seems to me, is I mean, of course, all this gives rise to this great question, which is, well, if the foundation of reality is perfect bliss, then how come we're all so miserable?
Yeah,
I mean, how is how did all this suffering and misery come about
yeah,
um, out of this perfectly blissful foundation? And this is where we begin to move into the domain of what we can call the ego, because what is going on, right? And like, once again, and I also want to emphasize that even though we're speaking in Hindu terms right now, these terms are applicable to all the great religions.
yeah,
Um, uh, Thomas Aquinas, for instance, the great Christian theologian, speaks of God as ipsum esse subsistens, which is Latin for self-subsistent being, right? And that's just another term for what we've been calling sot,
right,
right? And Thomas Aquinas will also speak of God as the supreme good, the supreme satisfaction of all desire. And that's just another way of speaking about what we've been calling Ananda. So
right,
these ideas are not confined to Hinduism. We find them expressed in all of the great religions.
yeah,
And and so there is another idea that we also find expressed, perhaps in somewhat different terms, in the great religions, and that is out of this fundamental unity that is Satchitananda,
yeah,
um, derives the enormous diversity of the created world, what we may speak of as the creation.
yeah,
And one way that I've thought of this, just an image to help express this, is if we think of the fundamental unity as like white light, then we might think of that white light as passing through a prism that breaks it up into all the many colors of the spectrum. And the white light would correspond to the fundamental unity. The prism would correspond to that unity's power of creation, and the many colors of the spectrum would correspond to the creation itself,
yeah,
which are all in some sense derived from the unity, but are each none of the individual colors is the unity itself, right?
Right. Yeah.
Them is as such incomplete. If we think of the fundamental unity as fundamentally complete, then each of the individual colors are incomplete.
Right.
And if Ananda um, is a characteristic of completeness, then the spiritual characteristic of incompleteness might be thought of as desire, right? So the character, what happens to that bliss when it
Yeah.
gets fragmented and becomes
See.
incomplete is that the different fragments of that bliss become desirous for that completion.
I
And
see.
um, and now desire is motivating us toward trying to realize that bliss which we don't just naturally have the way the fundamental unity has it. And of course, your experience speaks to that,
Yeah.
right? Because what you're suggesting is that at some point you were able to tap in to that sense of connection
Yeah.
with what is fundamental, with what is whole. And that tapping in to that sense of wholeness that allowed your desire, in a
Yeah.
sense, achieve its satisfaction in bliss.
Yeah, I stumbled upon it. Someone the other day asked me, what exactly did you do to arrive at that state? And I said, look, I just decided to do a technique which is known in the lucid dreaming community as mind awake, body asleep. And what I did was I kept trying to focus on one object in my mind, which was a lamp. And every time my mind got lost, I just patiently brought it back to the point of focus as many times as it took. And I said, I think the key to arrive at that state, which I wasn't aiming for, I was aiming for lucid dreaming. I think the key is to be patient because I just said to myself, I'm not going to get mad at myself. I'm not going to get mad at my own mind. I'm just going to, every time I get lost, when I realize that I've got lost, that my mind just went elsewhere, and suddenly you sort of realize it's almost like you're dreaming and you don't know that you're dreaming, and then you wake up to the fact that you're chasing thoughts, and then I just gently brought it back to the point of focus. Just focus on the lamp as many times as it took. Never get angry. And then all of a sudden I just, for some reason, I just experienced this shift, like it's like a, and everything was gone, and it was just amazing peace and this blissful stillness. It's almost like I didn't have to move or do anything to experience joy. But then, of course, that was followed by curiosity, and the curiosity led to the arrival of more thinking along the lines of who am I? Where am I? What is this? And that completely killed the original
And
state.
that,
And I
okay, broke it
literally
up.
felt like the thoughts were weighing on me, whereas before I was completely free and weightless, and just it was just nothing but awareness, and it was already fine. It was already okay. It was just it's hard to describe, it's
No,
just
yeah. I mean, I think the key, Orlando, is not to remain in that state because I don't think it's possible or even
yeah,
necessarily desirable to remain in that state of perfect bliss. I mean, there's a strange sense in which, and once again, we're getting very speculative, I suppose,
yeah,
but the supreme unity does not want to remain strictly in supreme unity. That's why, in some sense, it gives rise to the whole created world,
yeah,
right? There's some way in which, as I see it, the bliss expresses it's dynamic. It expresses itself through the dynamics of creation. It
yeah,
doesn't just sit there and be blissful,
yeah.
right? There's a dynamic to that bliss,
That's
which is
right.
the joy of creation. And
Yeah,
that's why the white light passes through that prism into this
yeah,
incredible world, which is full of drama and full of suffering.
Yeah.
But in some sense, the suffering is redeemed to the extent that we can recognize that however much suffering there is, it is ultimately contained
Yeah.
within the peace of God,
Yeah.
right? And that's the trick,
Yeah.
to be able to go through all the troubles of life in some sense and the struggles of life, which also have a great joyous quality to them as well,
Yeah.
right? Um,
Joyous,
but
and I would say selfless as well, because even though it's such a great state to be in, and if we could retain the human ego, I think to myself, if we could retain this human ego and be in that state, we'd probably want to be there forever and discard everything else. But the fact that you're practically selfless, I didn't even have a conception of Arlindo, and I just felt joyful, but I wasn't selfish to remain in that state, if that makes sense. And then I just felt
yeah, no,
curiosity.
it makes to me it makes perfect sense because because that is the big picture. I mean, God is not, so to speak, selfish to remain as God,
Yeah,
right? God is giving rise to everything else.
yeah,
And one of the, I mean, to me, one of the most profound images of that is in Christianity and the idea of Christ, who is, of course, an expression of the divine, but Christ takes upon himself humanity and suffers the extreme of what humanity can suffer on the
yeah,
cross, right? Um, and we have to understand that. I believe that
yeah,
as horrible as I mean, dying on a cross is obviously not a lot of fun. Um,
no,
as horrible as that is, it all takes place within, in some sense, the bliss of God. I
yeah,
mean, in other words, it's never desperately horrible. It's never horrible to the end. It's never horrible unto death. Because even, or to put it another way, even when it is horrible unto death, the self subsistence of the divine can bring that death back to life. And of course, that's the message of the resurrection
yeah,
in Christianity. Um, but what I think happens, okay, so the white light passes through the prism,
yeah.
and
I
now
like the analogy. Yeah,
here we are, right? Here we are as elements of fragments of that white light, desiring desiring our own subsistence, right? What happens is that we as individuals uh, are, in a sense, reflections of the divine, except that where the divine is at peace in its own self subsistence, we have a desire for
yeah,
self subsistence that we cannot satisfy through ourselves. And this is where the ego now comes in. Because what the ego is a psycho spiritual complex
yeah,
that is really designed um, for for pursuing our own individual well-being, right? And it's absolutely necessary. It's an absolutely necessary psychological structure, right? Because we have a kind of integral well-being that is distinct from everyone else. I need to eat.
yeah.
You don't need for me to eat in order for you to survive.
That's right.
You to eat in order for me to survive, right? So my ego is that part of me that is dedicated to my own um,
Self-preservation.
to my own subsistence
Yeah,
and ultimately my own thriving. That's what it's there to do. And you've got your ego, which is also dedicated to yours,
yeah,
um, and that's okay. I mean, I think that very often in spiritual talk, the ego gets a bad rap,
yeah. Get
right?
rid of the ego,
Um,
they say. Yeah,
got to
I
get
know.
rid of your ego, but
But you
I
need
don't
it.
think right. But you need your ego. I mean, it's like saying you have to get rid of your heartbeat. Yeah,
Yeah,
it's true, that your heart only delivers blood to your body, right? It
Yeah.
doesn't deliver blood to my body. So you've got a very selfish heart. And I've got a selfish heart because my heart is only pumping for me. It's not pumping for you.
Yeah.
But that doesn't mean we've got to get rid of the heart,
Yeah.
right?
It
The
reminds me
same
of
thing
the
with
selfish gene by
everything else.
Dawkins.
Right. So the
Yeah.
ego is a psychological structure that is designed to support our own well-being. Okay.
Yeah.
Now, and I believe what all the spiritual traditions teach is that in addition to the ego, but perhaps sort of behind the ego, because the needs, by the way, the needs of the ego, the needs of egoic life are very pressing,
Yeah.
right? You need to eat, you need to drink water every day. If you don't, if you're deprived of water, you're going to die.
Yeah.
You need to breathe every couple of seconds, right? I mean, if suddenly somebody prevents you from breathing, you're dead.
Yeah.
And so the needs of the ego, the needs of preserving our individuality are always very pressing, right? And in some sense, because they're so pressing, they can take precedence over higher needs. But I think that what all the spiritual traditions teach in different words and different languages is that in addition to the ego as a psycho-spiritual complex, we also have what we might call the spirit. And the spirit is our connection to the supreme unity.
Yeah.
It's our connection to that unity. And 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 that unity has a special relationship to the creation which arises out of the unity and remains in some sense contained within the unity. And that relationship, I mean, what bliss turns into in relation to the creation, but let me put it this way, what divine bliss becomes in relation to the creation is love, right? Because the creation is, and it's very much we can think of it like as an analogy between a mother and child. You know,
Yeah.
that child comes out of the mother, right? And it's just the natural inclination of a mother to
Yeah.
love her child. And I think we need to understand that it is just the natural inclination of the divine to love the creation that emerges out of that divine.
Yeah.
And the divine loves the whole of the creation, just like a mother loves the whole of her child. And so therefore, to the extent that we as individuals, through the spirit, can tap into the bliss of the divine, at the same time, we tap into the love of the divine, right? So the truly spiritually realized person is, and this once again we see as is what Christ represents, right? In some sense,
See.
the human being who is fully realized spiritually, the fully realized spiritual person naturally experiences a sense of love for all,
Yeah.
right? Love your neighbor as yourself, where the word neighbor refers to anyone with
Yeah.
whom you are in relation. Um, and that just naturally flows. I mean, I believe it just naturally flows through connection with the spirit.
Yeah.
Um, and um, and so here we now have the ego, which is self-concerned, and the spirit, which is universally concerned. Um, and but the spirit also, I mean, and here's this, in a sense, the beauty of the spirit is if you can tap into it, right?
Yeah.
Is that because the spirit loves all things, right? Loves all things within the love of the divine, which is once again the self-subsistent love,
Yeah.
right? Um, So the spirit doesn't only love others, it loves you too.
Yeah.
I mean, to be tapped into the spirit is to be aware not only that the spirit loves everybody else, but is to be aware that the spirit loves me,
Yeah.
loves it loves the very ego,
Yeah.
right? Is struggling in a sense for its own well-being.
Yeah.
And that sense of being grounded in the love of God, in the love of that fundamental unity, that resolves, I believe, at a deep level, the the anxiety of the ego for its own fundamental well-being. In other words, that in a sense, let me put it another way. What happens, and all of the spiritual traditions also speak of this, and we can talk about what might cause it, but there is almost, it seems to be a kind of inevitability, a kind of maybe tragic flaw, but it's not fully tragic. But the creation seems to lead to a forgetting on the part of the ego of the spirit, right? So the
Yeah.
ego loses touch with its connection with the divine. It loses touch with its connection to the spirit, which connects it to the divine. And when the ego loses touch with that, and of course we see this, this is expressed in the Garden of Eden myth,
Yeah.
in Western religion, right? Adam and Eve eat from the wrong tree, and all of a sudden they're out of sorts with God, and God throws them out of Eden. Um, and in the Hindu tradition, um, we have the notion of avidya, which means ignorance, right?
Right.
Which is another way of saying that the ego becomes ignorant of its connection with the fundamental unity. And in all the religions, there's some sense in which the ego gets lost.
I
In
see.
Plato's philosophy, he's got this notion of uh, omnemnesis, which is unforgetting. In other
Oh,
words,
right. Yeah. Yeah.
enlightenment involves an unforgetting, but the
Yeah.
reason we need to go through this unforgetting is because of our forgetting, right? So the
Yeah.
ego forgets its being in touch, it's being situated within the divine. And when the ego loses touch with that,
Yeah.
it becomes deeply anxious.
Yeah.
The ego has a desire for its own well-being. And if it can't sustain that well-being,
Yeah.
um, then it now becomes bereft, a sense of existential bereftness and anxiety overtakes the ego. Kierkegaard spoke of this, the Christian philosopher Kierkegaard spoke of this as despair. The ego is
Right.
now in despair because it can't save itself. And in order to handle that despair, there are only two ways of handling that despair. Well, there's only one way of actually handling it,
Yeah.
which is to get in touch with the spirit. But if you can't get back in touch with the spirit because you don't know that there's a spirit, because you have no way of knowing how to get back in touch with the spirit,
Yeah.
then then the ego will try to resolve its anxiety through the accumulation of worldly goods, right?
Yeah.
And that's where we get lust, and we get endless greed, and we get this egoistic lust for power, which of course we're now seeing overtaking the government of the United States in the person of Donald Trump, who is a person in whom the ego has completely eclipsed
Yeah.
this. Um, and I mean, the tragic dilemma of that is that you cannot resolve, the ego cannot resolve its struggle for well-being
Yeah.
ultimately through worldly things because those worldly things do not have the self-subsistence
Yeah.
of the community. They are also contingent. They're also passable. They are also ephemeral. They are also not can't provide that peace. And so therefore, no matter how much you have of it, you always feel you need more, right? Because it
Yeah.
never satisfies. So it doesn't
Yeah.
matter if Elon Musk has how many hundreds of billions of dollars, right? That doesn't
Yeah.
he's driven for more and more. But it doesn't matter how much he ends up having, there will never be enough
So
because they're
so
right.
although we spoke about ego before in terms of something that's necessary, which is a useful tool for us to self-sustain, um, we could also say that too much of something, too much of an ego can be noxious. It can set you back. So in the person of Donald Trump, ego would be something that's possessed him. He's completely ego possessed. I think perhaps Jung would probably speak in those terms. Ego is useful and we shouldn't get rid of it because we need all these different personas and we should tap into all these different archetypes. But at the same time, we shouldn't allow any one persona to, especially the ego, to take over. Otherwise, it's almost like the ego becomes the manager rather than all these different aspects of the self working together in unison to reach that harmony. So, in the person of Donald Trump, there's a massive imbalance, and and it causes him, or because he's lost, is kind of like a lost soul, isn't he? So, it Donald Trump would have undergone the same kind of anamnesis that we have all gone through. So we have all forgotten the divine realm, all that divine wisdom to become humans. But in the case of Trump, there's that kind of imbalance where ego and the narcissism has just taken over and he can't get out of it. He's just stuck in that mode. Would you say that's
Yeah.
a fair characterization?
Well, yeah, and I think that it's not as simple as that we've all connected to the spirit and Trump, somehow missed the boat.
Yeah,
Um, it's a matter of degree because and this is where the struggle between the ego and the spirit comes in. There are very, very few of us, if
yeah,
any of us, who are, fully in touch with the spirit. I mean, it's just for whatever reason, it's a hard thing to do. And a lot of that has to do with the fact that, once again, our egoic needs, which are bodily needs, I mean, at one level, bodily needs are egoic needs, are immediately pressing upon us.
yeah,
So, we can't just ignore them. So, and when you are experiencing these pressing needs, it becomes more difficult. I mean, the way that the image that I've often used, the way that I've tended to see it, is that if we can think of the spirit as the or as that in us that is capable of seeing the stars. You
yeah,
go out at night and you see all the stars, the cosmos, the vast whole cosmos, right? Um, but during the day, because of the proximity of one little star, right? There are billions upon billions, trillions upon trillions upon trillions of stars out there, but we are situated close to just one little star, the sun.
yeah,
And because of the brightness of the sun during the day, you can't see any of the stars.
yeah,
All you see is the light cast by the sun. Well, the ego sort of has something of that quality, I think, right? When the ego is there working on its day-to-day concerns, it kind of blocks out all the greater stars, right? So
yeah,
we can't see them. What we see are our egoic concerns,
yeah,
and it takes a certain kind of discipline, like the kind of meditational discipline that you engaged in,
yeah,
where you put yourself aside somehow to somehow that ego sets for a moment, and then wow, the stars come out. right?
Yeah.
But it usually can't last very long. Um, and and this then leads to, and this inability, we might say, this ignorance of the ego, um, this inability of the ego to recognize its place within the spirit is what I think is the central meaning of sin in Christianity. That's our severance from God. And what the ego does in compensation, and this is where what you were talking um, about how the ego becomes in some sense too big. I mean, the way that I tend to think of it is it's like an inflammation of the ego.
Yeah.
You know, we have
Yeah.
it in medical terms, right? If you have an inflammation of the stomach, or you have an inflammation of the heart, or an inflammation of the lungs, right? That's not good because the heart and the stomach and the lung, they all have to work together. If
Yeah.
one of them becomes too inflamed, it actually throws off the whole body. And similarly, you can have an inflammation of the ego where it becomes so inflamed that it no longer is it's the anxiety that is that is that is causing that inflammation and that is produced by that inflammation actually prevents the ego from recognizing itself as within the domain of the spirit. Because what happens is that the ego comes to think, because it doesn't have anything else to rely upon it but itself as far as it's concerned, it comes to think that the only thing that's going to save it is itself.
Yeah.
And so the inflammation of the ego causes a certain kind of anxiety or suffering. And the ego, that is the inflamed ego, in response to that anxiety and suffering, says to itself, I need to get even bigger.
Yeah.
I
Ego
need to get
inflation.
more, right? Um, because, that's how I'm going to secure myself against this hostile world. And so the ego, ironically and paradoxically, seeks to make itself even more inflamed in response to its inflammation,
Yeah.
and comes a vicious cycle.
Vicious cycle.
Uh,
Yeah.
the other piece of this that if we're going to somehow connect all this to the political situation we're looking at,
Yeah.
it, we we have to make the connection between the love that is characteristic of the divine. Remember, we spoke of the divine as like having a motherly love toward the creation.
Yeah.
Um, the love that is characteristic of the divine, right, gives rise to the extent that we as individuals, as egos, tap into that love, right? That's a good feeling and everything, and it might induce us to be nice to people.
Yeah.
Um, but but from a political point of view, it expresses itself in the notion of justice, in the notion that there are, we all need certain goods in order to survive and thrive in this world. And what the just person desires, and the just person is, as I see it, a person who is coming from this place of the spirit that values all people, right? What the just person desires is a distribution of goods that will benefit everyone, right? Whereas the ego
Yeah.
is concerned with itself, justice is concerned with the good of all.
Yeah.
And so this is a spiritual value. Um, those who are truly motivated by justice are motivated by the spirit. I mean, of course, we see wonderful examples of this in Martin Luther King and in Gandhi. These were people who were enormous advocates for justice, and they were rooted in a sort of spiritual connection.
Yeah.
Um, so it was a spiritually informed pursuit of justice. Um, and and democracy. That's a connection. Okay. Democracy is a political form that is actually rooted in a vision of justice. We often think of democracy as rooted in the valuation of freedom, right? We say, well, for a very long time,
Everyone
um,
gets a voice.
it was always referred to as the free world, right? We're the free world as opposed to everybody else, right? And democracy means freedom. Well, democracy does not mean freedom. I mean, it means respect for freedom. And there's a difference, right? I mean, a person who is truly dedicated to democracy is dedicated not only to their own freedom, but to being respectful of the freedom of all others, right? And you have to, in order to be respectful of others' freedom, you often have to restrain your own freedom,
Yeah.
right? Because you want this and they want that. And if I'm going to be respectful of their freedom to have what they want, I have to restrain what I want a little bit so that we can share,
Yeah.
right? We can both get something of what we want, which is justice. And
Yeah.
that's why at the end of the United States Pledge of Allegiance, I don't know if you're familiar with it, uh,
Somewhat,
in
yeah.
Britain, but it ends with the lines, with liberty and justice for all. Liberty
Right,
is
yeah.
and justice; those two have to go together.
Yeah.
Justice constrain liberty, and liberty has to be the goal of justice, but liberty for all,
Yeah.
right? Not just liberty for me, right? The person who is totally dominated by the ego doesn't say with liberty and justice for all, but with liberty and justice for me,
Yeah.
right? And everybody else can be forgotten about.
Yeah.
Um, and so, to the extent that a society begins to lose touch with the spirit, I believe, it's going to lose touch as well with a sense of the true value and, in a sense, sanctity of democracy as a
Yeah.
political system, right? And society then degenerates
Yeah.
into what Thomas Hobbes called the war of all against all,
Yeah.
right? Everybody is just out for themselves.
Is this what
Um,
American democracy, American capitalism, I would say, sorry. Do you reckon capitalism in America is turning into that? A fight for all against all, and you know, and if you are thinking about the liberty, and if you're thinking about being just towards everyone else, and you're thinking about equal distribution of wealth, then you are seen as weak. Maybe that's how Trump sees it. The justice and the and the equality of opportunity in his heart is perhaps seen as a weakness. It's counter to how he operates. What he thinks is strength is to accumulate wealth and not care about anyone else. In fact, you can trample on others
be
if
contemptuous
if
of
you have
others,
to.
right? And trample on others, right?
Yeah, yeah,
Exactly. Um, well, I'm glad you brought in capitalism into this equation because it's in a sense that it's the next step I think to think about.
right.
Um, Adam Smith, who is generally thought to be the father of capitalism, right, with his book The Wealth of Nations,
Yeah,
um, really came up with a brilliant idea. The brilliant idea was this: that we could use the motivations of the ego to achieve the goals of the spirit. This was Adam Smith, to put it in my terms, this was Adam Smith's idea, right? What we ultimately want is an economic system that will serve everybody. Now, an economic system that's going to serve everybody, right? That's a goal of the spirit, because whenever we're talking about serving everybody rather than just me, we're talking about the spirit rather than the ego,
Yeah.
right? So the idea of crafting an economic system that is going to be best for everybody is basically a spirit motivated idea.
Yeah.
Okay.
More
But
altruistic.
right, altruistic, exactly. What what Adam Smith came to suddenly realize is, wait a minute, but people, what gets in the way very often of a spirit society, I'm putting it in my terms, not necessarily in his terms,
Yeah.
is, um, is egoism, but we can use the motivations of the ego, right? If we design the system properly, we can use the motivations of the ego to serve the goals of the spirit. Um, and we can do that through this free marketplace, right? Where every individual entrepreneur is going to be motivated to provide the best service for the least amount of money, so that they can make the most profit for themselves,
Yeah.
right? What we want to do is design a system where making the most profit for yourself depends upon providing the best value for your customers. And if you can craft a system where making the most profit for yourself depends upon providing the best value for your customers, then you can have a system in which people pursuing their own egoistic interest, which is to say maximizing their own profit, right, results in their engaging in what we might think of as altruistic behavior, which is providing the best value for others. That
Right.
was its sort of little brilliant insight.
Yeah.
And
So in other words, you have to help yourself in order to be able to help others. And you have to start from somewhere, even if it's a completely egoic position, and then you
right,
spread.
or to put it the other way around,
Right.
it's not that you have to help yourself in order to help others, it's that you have to help others in order to help yourself.
Right. Okay. Yeah, yeah, even better. Yeah.
You have to help others in order to help yourself. So since you're motivated to help yourself, now you're going to have to help others in order to help yourself. And
Yeah.
that's going to be the basis of the capitalist idea. Um, and it's it's brilliant, and it has worked in many ways. It has worked brilliantly, but it has I don't know if I want to call it a tragic flaw, but it has a a danger, a danger embedded within it. And the danger is that if we prioritize and emphasize the profit motive and the ego motive to such a great extent that we lose sight of the spiritual goal that capitalism is there to serve, then what happens is that the system, the capitalist system, will break down into a Hobbesian war against all,
Yeah.
in which there's no law, in which people start to manipulate the system so that they no longer have to serve everyone else in order to serve themselves. Because they
Yeah.
manipulate, they take control of the government, they take control of the marketplace. Monopolies are take control of the marketplace. Once you've got control of the marketplace, you no longer have to provide value for your customers, because you are no longer dependent on your customers. Your customers are dependent on you.
Yeah.
Once you switch that around so that the company is no longer dependent upon its customers are dependent upon the company, and the company has no competition. And now the company can do whatever it likes, right? And completely exploit its customer base um, in the name of just maximizing its profits indefinitely. Uh, and so capitalism can break down in all these ways. And it can break down precisely to the extent that we lose sight of what the goal of capitalism should be, which is to benefit the common good, to
Yeah.
benefit the welfare of society as a whole, not simply the capitalist. And there are ways of designing capitalism. And here's where, in a sense, we could speak of it as democratic capitalism. Maybe that would be a word for it.
Yeah.
Democratic system, right? And democracy is a system that is dedicated to the welfare of all,
Yeah.
right? It's a power of the people. Democracy needs to control capitalism to keep capitalism in check and to ensure that capitalism remains responsive to the welfare of the people. And so then
Yeah.
we need, and very often we need supplements to capitalism like healthcare supplements and such things as that. All this, we've been, I don't know, how are we doing for time here? Are we, we're,
Uh, see. Well, we're about 25 minutes away from an hour and a half.
okay. Well, we can start to sort of wrap it up a little bit, but
It's been great already. I have to tell you,
with
yeah.
that,
It's been great. We've
yeah,
covered a lot of
we've
ground
covered a lot of
already, yeah.
territory and connected a lot of things. But just to sort of wrap it up a little,
Yeah.
um, so what I see happening right now um, is, and I think that it is in some respects a function of runaway capitalism. But I don't want to put capitalism down because I think that capitalism, the free market, has can work in the Smithian way that Adam Smith envisioned,
Right.
where it's serving the greater good. But it can only work in that Smithian way to the extent that it is governed by people
Yeah.
who are concerned not with maximizing their own profit, but who are connected to the spirit sufficiently to concern themselves with the overall common good. And what we've seen in the United States, I mean, Trump is again the perfect example of this, right? The businessman,
Yeah.
right? The man dedicated to his own profit,
Yeah.
taking over the country and remodeling the country as his business that
Yeah.
is going to directly serve his own ego, his own monetary profit, and his own accumulation of power.
Yeah.
And all right, the very
The problem
last
is human
thing,
greed. Yeah.
oh yeah, the very last thing we can maybe try and connect to this, and it still remains something of a mystery, is why would so many evangelical Christians not only not be appalled by Trump, but be enthralled by him. And and that's a long story. I think the answer to that question is a long story. But I think to some degree, what can happen in some versions of religion is that rather than really connecting in a deep way with um, the spirit comes to be represented legalistically rather than spiritually. The connection becomes the idea is, well, God is represented, and this happens very much in Western religion. God is represented as a kind of ego himself. God
Yeah.
is just an ego writ large. God is just the grandest ego of all with all this power.
Yeah.
And God has these rules that God wants you to follow for whatever reason, right? It's not entirely clear why God has these rules, but they're his rules, and he gets really, really pissed if you don't follow them because he's such a grand ego that he's offended. He's egoistically offended by people who aren't doing what he tells them to do, right?
Yeah.
And and so therefore you'd better do what he tells you to do or you're going to be in trouble. And of course in Christianity we have this idea of hell, the eternal fires of hell, and it's, terrifying. It's certainly terrifying. I mean, if you really believed that there was some super powerful being who was going to flick you into the eternal fires of hell if you didn't follow what he had to say, you'd want to follow what he has to say.
Yeah.
Um, but um, but I believe what happens with that sort of religiosity is that the desires of the ego, the egoism, the inflammation of the ego, it doesn't really get healed. It doesn't really, it gets healed through connection with the spirit. It doesn't get healed through servile legalism. What
Right.
happens under a kind of servile legalistic religion is the ego gets suppressed. It gets suppressed, right? It's still there, but it's been suppressed and suppressed and suppressed. And then you get a guy like Donald Trump who shows up and says,
Yeah.
hey, you can let it out.
Yeah.
Let that go that you have been keeping in that little box over there,
Yeah.
suppressed and suppressed and
And
suppressed. And
just lash out.
you have to be a nice guy and you have to love your neighbor. Let it out, because I'm letting it out. And look, not only am I letting it out, but I'm successful in letting it out.
Yeah.
And so you let it out and be successful as well. And I think on the part of some of Trump's followers, there's a great sense
Yeah.
of liberation, but it's an egoistic liberation.
I,
That's
I
why I
still
think,
I still remember one of the things he said after he won back in 2016. He addressed the crowd and he said, I ran for president for the first time and I won. And he just spread his arms like that. And the adulation, people were cheering. And it's like this guy just wants to be deified. He just, it's like he's got a God complex. It's unbelievable. Yeah. And it's all about him.
yeah,
And because he was so successful, because he did everything right, according to
yeah,
himself, people should listen to him. And right
right,
there, he's
right,
got control, he's got influence. To
right.
anyone who's not
Simply
paying
that he,
attention, yeah.
yeah. And it wasn't simply that he did everything right. In some weird way, he did everything wrong
Yeah,
and was still successful.
yeah,
So
and we're
you
still
can be
successful.
successful in doing everything wrong.
Yeah,
And then that turns into this whole weird idea of the prosperity gospel, which, that big God up in the sky is must really love billionaires because he's rewarded them with all these billions.
yeah,
So billionaires really must be favored by God. And once religion goes in that direction, we have a complete perversion of the fundamental message
yeah,
that all these great religious seers have been trying to present to us.
yeah. I was going to say before I let you go, we still have a few minutes left. I'm still trying to work out the difference between Christian existentialism and existentialism, because I keep going back to what Kierkegaard said about essence and existence. So he said for people, uh, existence precedes essence. So the purpose only comes after a human being is born, whereas for an object, it's the other way around. Um, Essence
I'm not
precedes
sure.
existence because because people always have a goal in mind, a purpose for the object that they're about to build. So I'm wondering if there's something going on there with Christian existentialism and if it connect with the indirect interpretation of the Bible. Because I have let me see, I have yeah, I have a quote here by Kierkegaard. He said, "Who has the more difficult task, the teacher who lectures on earnest things a meteor's distance from everyday life, or the learner who should put it to use?" And I'm wondering if this is kind of like a rhetorical question which appeals to the notion of indirect communication in the Bible. You know, if it's like how can I put it? You know, the Bible, you're supposed to derive from the Bible what suits you according to how you view the world and your own heart and how you know, how you are poised to follow your own needs and what makes sense to you and all that meaning. So the Bible will speak to you according to how you're made in a way and what you've become. Have I got this right, or am I completely off track?
Well, I mean, you're touching upon a lot
Right.
of different,
I'm probably
all of
muddled.
which, all of them are interesting. But in a sense, they almost need to be separated out in order to address them
I thought so.
properly, as I see it. But just to get back to the idea of the distinction between Christian existentialism and
Yeah.
existentialism, let's start with that.
Yeah.
Um, the way that I tend to see it, I mean, if we think of the existentialist movement as being as being represented largely by people like Jean-Paul Sartre and Albert Camus. Jean-Paul Sartre, in Being in Nothingness, speaks of life as a futile passion. Right?
Yeah.
It's a futile passion. It's a passion, but it's futile. In other words, it's a passion that can never satisfy itself. Right? We're constantly struggling for some sort of satisfaction that we cannot actually achieve.
Yeah.
Okay, and we get a similar image in Camus' work, The Myth of Sisyphus. Right?
Right.
Sisyphus is an ancient Greek figure who was punished by the gods um, uh, and forced to continuously roll a rock up a hill. And then when
Yeah.
he finally gets to roll up the rock up to the top of the hill, the rock rolls down again. And
Yeah.
he's perpetually doing that. So that is once again a kind of image of what it would mean to be engaged in a futile passion, right? The
Yeah.
passion to get up a hill and then it just keeps rolling down again.
Yeah.
So what's the futile passion? So I think one of the great insights of the existentialist is to recognize, and we already talked about this in some sense, that the ego's attempt to find its own self-satisfaction is a futile passion, right? The ego can't become in and of itself Saccidananda.
Yeah.
It doesn't have the ontological capability of being what is ultimate in existence,
That's
right?
right.
And so its effort to achieve a kind of self-subsistence, self-ultimacy, self-ananda, self-bliss, right, through itself is precisely a futile passion. And
Yeah.
it will have the quality of like trying endlessly to roll a rock up a hill that
Yeah.
however successful you get, it just keeps rolling back down again.
Yeah.
Um, so what's the difference between that vision and Christian existentialism? Christian existentialism agrees that the ego's attempt to find satisfaction through itself is a futile passion, but then
Right.
adds one thing to it and says,
Yeah.
but there is actually a way for the ego to find satisfaction, but not through itself, through connection to the spirit, right?
Right. So it has to transcend itself
It has
because
to,
ego is itself an emanation to use Neoplatonic terms. So ego would be like a projection from the prism, one of its colors, I suppose.
Yeah,
Um, but in order to for everything to be okay, it kind of needs to transcend itself to get in touch with the spirit, the white light, you know.
exactly. Exactly. And I've come to speak of that. And once again, very often in the spiritual traditions, we hear people talking about annihilating the ego or killing the ego or doing away with the ego. I don't think you can do that. I think the ego is a necessary structure.
Yeah,
But I think we can speak of what the term I've come to use is the sanctification of the ego.
right.
That is, the ego comes to experience itself as embedded within
Yeah,
and connected to and in communion with the divine.
yeah,
And that is what I call the sanctified ego.
yeah.
And now the ego naturally, spontaneously lives in accordance with the.
Oh, uh, have we lost connection there? You're frozen on my screen. Can you hear me? Okay, something must have happened there. Richard?
Voice, but you're no longer moving.
Oh, okay, yeah. I think we lost connection there
Okay.
for a minute. Okay, I think the internet connection is a bit unstable at the moment. Can you hear me now? Okay, let me just check. We're having some technical issues here at the moment. Um, that's very strange. 1 second. No, everything's all right. You're frozen on my screen.
What that? Okay.
Yeah, here we go.
Okay.
Yeah. So yeah, we're back. Yeah,
Yeah.
we had some technical issues, but yeah, you were saying that, about Christian existentialism.
Yeah. So yes, we were talking about how Christian existentialism is really, in the form of somebody like Paul Tillich, um, is addressing the issues that are raised or using Christianity or showing how Christianity can address the existential issues that are raised by people like Sartre and Camus.
Yeah.
And I think we have in our talk discussed how that might be. There's one last thing maybe it would be worthwhile to say, and I know that this has been like a big dump of information of ideas, but
It's all good stuff. Yeah.
um, yeah, um, but one of the things that happened, and this is a function in some ways of our human cognitive limitations, um, is that we are very much this worldly beings. We live in this world, and as I say, our worldly needs and desires are the things that are most pressing for us, um, and therefore language and our cognitive capacities have largely evolved uh, as a way of dealing with the world, right? The world of diverse things, the world of distinct things and of other egos.
Yeah.
And so, therefore, as a consequence of that, when we try to talk about the spirit, when we try to think about matters of the spirit, we are almost of necessity, we are almost forced, given our cognitive limitations, to think about them in worldly, kind of egoistic terms. Um, are you frozen again?
No, 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 I'm listening.
Um,
Sorry, yeah, I was just listening intently. Yeah.
no, okay. When worldly, egoistic terms, so that we end up, as we were saying, representing God as as an egoistic being rather than as a being who is the spirit that we've been talking about. And when God is represented in these egoistic terms, it creates a distortion within religion
Yeah.
and within and and in some sense, the more concrete, the more we insist upon reading scripture in very literalistic, very concrete ways, the more we can end up distorting our understanding of
Yeah,
what is actually trying to say.
that's
Um,
right. We,
and
we miss all the
that's
poetry in the
also,
Bible, don't we? If we do that, not just the Bible, any
yeah,
kind of scripture, we just if we're just taking it all to be literal, then we miss the poetry, the meaning behind it, because you can pack so much meaning into one sentence if that sentence uh, is in the form of poetry rather than just pure prose, isn't it?
yes.
You
And,
know,
it's interesting that the Bible itself warns us against this. Paul says somewhere, um, the letter killeth, but the spirit giveth life. In other words, um, the letter being my interpretation of that, meaning a literalistic understanding or reading of scripture can actually move us in the wrong direction. So it's a dilemma for religion, and it's a dilemma that religion is constantly having to work with. And that's what keeps people like me who do philosophy of religion busy,
yeah.
trying to sort this all out and find ways of expressing things that can cut through the distortions and perversions.
Is there a way in which um, Paul Tillich's conception of God differs from Thomas Aquinas's conception? Because I heard, let's see if I find it here, um, that so for Tillich, God was the ground of being, which seems to contradict the idea that God is beyond essence and existence. Whilst oxymoronically arguing for the existence of God, which was problematic. Um, it was a problematic position argued by Thomas Aquinas, wasn't it? Or am I wrong? But Tillich would
Thomas
would also
Aquinas,
agree that with the objectification, or disagree with the objectification of God, wouldn't he? I mean, or have I got this wrong?
Thomas Aquinas says that God's essence is existence, that
Right,
existence is the essence of God.
right,
And once again, to me, that's very similar to the Hindu notion, that Sat is essential to God. Sat is the self-subsistent existence of God.
right.
And I believe that also is paralleled in Paul Tillich's notion of God as the ground of being. So I see them all saying in slightly different ways something very similar.
Right, yeah, yeah, so would I. Because so in a way, God would be existence itself, and perhaps both men
God is
meant,
existence itself.
yeah. And so it's not any one thing, but it's everything that's in it. So in a way, it's almost like they are advocating for a kind of pantheism and maybe panentheism. It all is within God, but God can't be described as any one thing. So in a sense, it's apophatic theism in a sense, perhaps, because you can't find any. You can speak of God by what is not, is not just one single thing, is everything, is existence itself, everything that goes is within God. So you can't say that any one thing is God, because if you're going to narrow your focus to one finite thing to the exclusion of everything else, well, then you're missing out on the glory of God, which is infinite.
Absolutely. And that representation of God in finite form, and maybe I should put it, the taking of something finite as God is the meaning of idolatry. Um,
Yeah,
and Tillich is very clear about that. So I do see. I mean, there are certainly differences between Tillich's theology and Thomas Aquinas's theology and Hindu theology. I mean, if we get into the nitty gritty of them, we'll find differences and some important differences. But at that fundamental level, I see them as very similar. Thomas Aquinas sees God as existence itself. Um, and therefore, since
Yeah,
we exist through the existence of God. There's no other way to see it, right? Our
yeah,
existence must somehow be embedded in the existence of God because God is existence.
that's right. That's right.
And
I ought to explore Thomas Aquinas a bit more because I read something interesting about him in a book called Alchemy by one of Carl Jung's students, actually. She was a psychoanalyst herself. Franz, what was her name? I can't remember her name. I know one of her names is Franz. I'm kicking myself over it now. But yeah, she in the book she describes the dark night of the soul and she describes the concept of a rising dawn. And then she talks about Thomas Aquinas and that towards the end of his life he fell into a very strange stupor. And when he woke up from that state, he said, I feel as though everything I've written is like straw. It's
yeah,
and it's almost like, and apparently Carl Jung um, described it as Thomas Aquinas being overwhelmed by the collective unconscious, which would be Kastrup's mind at large. And there was so much information that suddenly, when he woke up, he looked back on the work he had produced in his life as a human being, and he said, "Well, it's almost like it's lost its meaning." In by comparison, it's like straw or something along those lines. I mean,
yeah, that's a famous line. And of course, straw, when we think of straw, we think of something very dry,
yeah,
right? It's very dry and brittle and insubstantial in some ways. And I think that, my impression is that what Thomas Aquinas apparently or presumably experienced was the spirit, in its richness,
yeah,
and largely that is not, even though you can use your intellect to try and make sense of it intellectually and
yeah,
express it intellectually, I would see it as largely an experience of the heart,
yeah,
right? I mean, really you are swept up into the love of God and
yeah.
everything else and all those many, 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 many words
Cannot
and
compare.
logical inferences that Thomas Aquinas made were just attempts to point to this incredible experience of love
Yeah.
that overwhelmed him.
Which
And
reminds me of my own experience because I felt like that once I woke up from that experience, once I was back to being me, from that bliss, at first I thought, maybe the Buddha was right. Maybe there's something to what the Buddha said before. But now, having read that book as well, uh, by Louise Marie von Franz. That's her name. Yeah, yeah. One of Jung's students and friend. And she said, yeah. So when she was describing what Thomas Aquinas experienced and what he said, now I think that perhaps I underwent something similar when I tried to describe my own experience but failed. So the whatever narratives I came up with to try and describe that state, I failed. So it's almost like the words were like straw. I mean that's how I see it when taking into account my own experience. So I'm thinking
right,
maybe he went through something similar as well. Thomas Aquinas, the Buddha, perhaps, and in defense of the Buddha as well, I would say that um, he never spoke of getting rid of the ego. I think he was speaking along the lines of seeing through it like an illusion, almost like the ego isn't really a concrete thing It's just an illusion, a production of Mara or something like that. So,
Well, I don't know where the Buddha speaks about the ego per se, but I know that they speak about tanha, second
right.
noble truth, is that the suffering of life, dukkha, is produced
Yeah.
by tanha,
Dukkha and Tanha. Yeah.
is often translated desire, but I think that's a too general translation.
Yeah.
My interpretation of it, anyway, is that by tanha, he means egoistic, the egoistic drive toward self-subsistence,
Right.
right? And that's right, the egoistic drive toward self-subsistence, which is the kind of panicky drive on the part of the ego to
Yeah.
to find something permanent to rest upon. But there is nothing permanent in this world, right? That's one of the teachings of Buddhism, the teaching of Anicca. The world is fleeting, the world is ephemeral. There is nothing permanent, and so the
Right.
ego, in trying to find something permanent to rest itself upon, is like Sisyphus trying
Right.
to roll that rock up that hill, and it
Yeah.
just won't stay there. Um, and so ultimately, when you can put that flame of desire, that flame of lust, really out, then it's like the sun setting, and now you can see the stars.
Right.
You
That's
know,
right. Because desire is a kind of attachment. You're attached
right?
to behave a certain way because you feel like you have to, and you're pushing that rock up the hill, but you don't really have to, um, or you don't have to become attached to things. You can still do what you want to do, but you don't have to become attached to the things that you like. You can.
Well,
So in a way, we're trying to get to a state where we can be, even if we can't do the things that we would like to do. If we can't do them for some reason, we should be able to be okay with it. It's okay if we can't, we can like that thing, but if that thing isn't available for us or it gets taken away, if the object of desire gets taken away, we could get to a state where it's okay, where we can be okay with not having that. If that makes sense. I mean, is that the best
no,
way of?
I think that makes perfect sense. I think that's what it is,
Otherwise, it
and
leads to
we
suffering, doesn't it? Dukkha. Is it dukkha?
right. Dukkha, yeah,
Yeah.
dukkha is the suffering, but it's not just any suffering. In other words, these terms get abbreviated,
Yeah.
so yeah, I mean, you have to be able to put it in, on a single poster.
It's more like
So,
dissatisfaction. Yeah, they get distorted when they
it
when they
has
get
to be,
translated, don't they?
it has to be further explicated. But dukkha is as I see it, my understanding is that it's the suffering that comes from, it's Sisyphus's suffering. It's the suffering that comes from the fact that you cannot satisfy this drive of the ego to be its own subsistence, to be its own foundation or basis. And so there's this endless, endless kind of panic almost on the part of the ego. And that panic itself not only creates inner suffering,
Yeah,
but it leads to the war of all against all, in
yeah,
which there's the struggle to dominate the world, so that the ego, because that's how the ego is going to provide for its own security by dominating its world. Well, if my ego has to dominate my world, and your ego has to dominate your world, and my world and your world are the same world, we're going to be at war with one another.
yeah.
Um, and
It
so
leads to a Hobbesian, Thomas Hobbes, the Hobbesian world,
a
as opposed to
Hobbesian
the Adam
war
Smith. Yeah,
all. And that's what I understand dukkha to refer to. All the the troubled nature of human existence that is a function of the ego's attempts to do what the ego just cannot do. It's not ontologically
yeah,
equipped or capable of providing its own foundation. And so once again, what is the solution to this? Well, again, in the Western religions and in Hinduism, it's expressed in a positive way that the solution is to connect with the spirit.
Yeah.
Buddhism, it's expressed negatively. And the idea, as I understand it, once again, is that if you can put out the flame, the passion of the ego to do this, if you can stop that, if that can be let go, then in some sense the connection to the spirit will happen all by itself. You don't have to
Yeah.
name it,
That's
right?
right.
It will. That's what's left when the ego stops its crazy panic.
Yeah.
Um,
It's a kind of
and
liberation, isn't it?
yeah, and one of the dangers of naming it, of calling it God or calling it Christ or calling it whatever, is that once you represent it as a kind of finite thing,
Yeah.
you know, then we get into this notion that we've got this egoistic God that we've got to please, and that endeavor to please an egoistic God in order to be rewarded by that God, or in order to avoid punishment from that God, is itself just more of the ego's attempt to
Yeah.
find its way to saving itself.
And
So,
notions of an egoistic God are easily refuted by atheists. And then if everyone thinks of God as just meaning that concept, that egoistic concept of God, then we run the risk of losing a proper concept of God altogether, and then we fall into despair and chaos, and we risk worshipping narcissistic leaders. I think Nietzsche warned us about that, didn't he?
oh,
Or something.
absolutely.
Yeah,
I don't know about Nietzsche, but yeah, and that so we've come around full circle here, and yeah, I think the loss of this connection, this authentic connection to the spirit, um, which in our society may be somewhat a result of kind of runaway consumer capitalism,
yeah,
um, has has allowed for somebody like Donald Trump to
yeah.
step into the void
I think
and say,
once Trump finishes his term, someone should get him to a spiritual retreat or something, to see if he
yeah.
that might be impossible.
Anyway, Orlando, this has been a wonderful conversation. We've covered so much territory, and I
Definitely.
just want to thank you for providing the opportunity for us to have it.
No problem. Thank you very much for participating one more time, and yeah, I'm gonna see if I get the wife to merge both videos together, and
Okay.
then yeah, once it's ready, I'll let you know. But thank you very
Okay,
much.
very good. And okay, great. Thank you so much, Orlando, and have a wonderful rest of your day.
You too. Take care, Richard.
Take care.